Well, hi there, Faithful Politics listeners and viewers. If you're joining us on YouTube, thanks so much for being here, guys. We love being able to bring you guys great content. So make sure you share this with someone, like and subscribe, do all that jazz. I'm Josh Burtram, your faithful host. We also have with us, as always, Will, our political host. It's good to see you, Will.
Well, hey, don't sound so surprised. I'm not that hard to look at, but it's good to be here.
Yes, absolutely. And today we have the great honor and privilege to have Ian Harber on the show. Ian is a writer and Christian media producer. He's written for the Gospel Coalition, Mere Orthodoxy and Relevant. He writes about reconstructing faith in his newsletter, Back Again, and about faith, media, and technology at Endeavor. He lives in Denton, Texas with his wife and sons. And today we're going to talk to him about his latest book, Walking Through Deconstruction from InterVarsity Press. Ian, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks for being here.
Josh, Will, thank you for having me. I'm excited to chat with you.
Yes, absolutely. So I got to ask, of course, with the title like Walking Through Deconstruction, I'm assuming there's some personal experience that's tied up in this. So I'd love for you to kind of give your story to help us understand and kind of map how you got from, whatever it is you were to walking through deconstruction to Back Again. I'd love to kind of hear the overall thing and then why you wrote the book.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the book is not a memoir, and that was actually really important to me to not write a memoir. I don't think I'm probably not old enough to be writing a memoir, but the book is extremely personal. It comes out of my experience walking through deconstruction and reconstruction, and just a lot of different circumstances in my life and the lessons that I learned and adding research and study to that as well. And so, I always hate being the guy that says it started when I was born, but it's just the truth. It is, I was born into a broken family. And so like my very first day was in a broken family with my parents. And so that did not last long. I was taken, my dad left. I was taken from my mom when I was 3.5 by CPS, and I was given to my grandparents. And that was the beginning of my life. That was the first 3.5 years of my life. And I have memories from that time, And so this frames every single thing in my life is this part of my story. And so I'm raised by my grandparents in a Christian home. My grandparents are wonderful. I have nothing against them. They were phenomenal people. But they raised me in the church and the Christian schools and stuff like that. They did their best. And unfortunately, a lot of the places that I ended up in were just, I sometimes say the word fundamentalist, and I think people get a really specific idea in their mind, and it's not an entirely inaccurate idea, but I really like the word anxious better than fundamentalist in a lot of ways. Just anxious evangelical environments where if there's any sort of questioning, deviation from a very prescribed script, a very narrow doctrinal perspective. We're not talking about outside of Orthodox Christianity, just a very narrow lane in Christianity. If you even start to question that, your salvation is questioned. You know what I'm talking about. So I'm raised in these environments, and pretty early in my life, a lot of things start happening. So day after Christmas, when I'm in 8th grade, my grandmother passes away from cancer, chronic lymphocytic leukemia. And that was the first in a series of 12 funerals that I ended up going to over the next 2.5 years. The last one being my mom, who took her own life. And so, and the others are various family and friends. And, I had a couple uncles die in there from brain cancer and, just a whole bunch of different stuff. So I'm trying to wrap my brain around what is going on in all of this. And so, again, this is a complicated, messy story. And I think that's part of the point. When we're talking about deconstruction, there's nothing clean about this. Along this time, I come across one of the original deconversion stories on YouTube. Now, right now on TikTok, which I guess probably by the time this comes out won't even, it's going to be banned or whatever. But these stories are a dime a dozen on the internet now. But at the time, that was not the case. And so one of the first ones, in this former Christian sort of just calmly, compassionately, systematically walked through this series of pillar beliefs that knocked down his faith And it knocked down my faith. I got to the end of that and I thought, there's no credible way that I can, with any intellectual integrity, believe this stuff anymore. And so that was sort of the last straw for me in a lot of ways. And so there was a period where I sort of walked away completely and, will call myself an atheist or experiment with kind of different things or whatever. And then about some time after that, I decided for the first time in a long time to read the Gospel of Matthew, because I thought, I want to give this another fair shake. So I read the Gospel of Matthew, and I got to the end of that, and I told myself, I don't know if God is real. Like, I can't unsee what I've seen. These are credible objections to our faith. But if God is real, Jesus is pretty awesome. And so it would be great if he was like Jesus, if God was like Jesus. And so I did pray, and I told God, and I don't even have good theology for this. I just am trying to relay what happened. I told God, I said, I don't know if you're real. I don't know if any of this stuff is real, but I'm not going to fake this. Like, I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not. I'm not going to, just do this halfway. I'm going all in. I'm going to pursue the truth, and you're either there or you're not. And so if that's okay, that's what I'm going to do. And I just distinctly hearing this, I don't know if it wasn't audible, but just this really powerful feeling of, I can work with that. And so I thought, okay, so that was sort of the beginning of at least me getting back into like a Christian stream. And that took me into more progressive places. And so that, we're talking Rob Bell, Richard Rohr, Pete Rollins, Rachel Held Evans, just kind of going down that, named that whole crew of that era, going down there. And there's other stuff that's happening this time. I had a mentor in the church who was very, very close to me, and ended up abusing 5 of my friends, and obviously being fired from the church and stuff like that. And so that was worse for my friends than it was for me, but I was very much in the inner circle of that, and it was very painful, lots of betrayal. So you can kind of fast forward my life. I'm working through all this stuff for years, graduate college, get married, and a year later, my grandfather, who raised me, passes away in a fluke plane crash. And so he was actually a pilot all his life, and so he died flying a plane, which is interesting. But so that was very difficult, and I had recently just enrolled to get formal theological training for the first time in my life through kind of a shrunken seminary program at a local church. And so he passed away before that started, and I almost didn't do it, but I decided, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and do it. And so I go to the first day of class, and one of the teachers, he stands up and he says, we do theology in the light so that we can stand on it in the dark. And I thought, well, that would have been good to know a long time ago, because I'm in the darkest season of my life right now. So not exactly doing it in the light to stand on in the dark, but I have an open mind. I'm coming with my grief, with my doubts, with my questions, with everything that I've wrestled with over the past however many years. And I'm just going to be here and see what happens. And, sure enough, it turns out a lot of what I was, taught growing up, these are these secondary, tertiary issues. That it's not that they're not important. Of course they're important. But these are not the things that these are not the things that make a Christian, that every Christian has always agreed on. These are other things that we can debate about and argue about and agree and disagree on, but they're not what make Christianity, And so what I learned in that program was the core of the faith. And it felt like Jesus has that line where he says, the teacher of the law who's a disciple is like someone who goes into the storehouse and brings out treasures new and old. And that is what happened. That is exactly what happens. Just diving into the core of faith. Who is God? What is the Bible? How do we know what truth is? How do we, all these different things. And it was revolutionary for me. It was like no one had ever taught me that. And I, without bringing the issue of like, when was I saved into it? Because I don't know. It felt like being saved all over again in that time, because it was just like the eyes of my heart were open, and then God enlightened. And it's just like, oh, I see it now. I see this now. And that place had some distinctives that I still don't know if I agree on or disagree on, but it doesn't matter. Like, here's the core of the faith that is what makes Christians, and it's in all of its goodness and truth and beauty. And that is something that I can build on. That is a foundation. That is a stable foundation for me to build on, and grow on. And so that was sort of the beginning of a reconstruction process for me, And whereas like, okay, I actually believe, I can say I believe this stuff and I mean it. And I mean it with everything in me, not just at an intellectual level, but at an existential, experiential level. So, I mean, we're talking about a decade plus long experience here. I'm trying to encapsulate it in, a couple minutes, but yeah, that basically is sort of what that experience of deconstruction and reconstruction was like for me. Going through that process in those Christian environments. I use the word anxious for a reason, because that anxiety of my questions and my doubts and the times when I didn't know what I believed or entertained or held beliefs that were contrary to the environments that we're in were met with anxiety. And I was just I just had a lot of confrontations, when I was genuinely seeking the truth and genuinely trying to figure this stuff out and wrestling through things at both an existential and an intellectual level, and being seen as just trying to be argumentative or just trying to, ruffle somebody's feathers or be sort of like, outrageous or whatever. I'm like, no, I'm literally trying to figure these things out. These are my actual questions and you're not answering them. Why are we not dealing with the issue? And so, so that's sort of my story of going through that.
Yeah, that's a really touching story, Ian. And gosh, I mean, like my heart goes out to you for, all the speed bumps, to put it lightly, that you've had to drive over in your journey. I'm really fascinated by this topic of deconstruction. I wasn't raised in the church. Like most people that have a deconstruction story, like there are patterns, or at least in my experience, there seem to be patterns of similarities between stories where folks talk about, I was raised in the church, insert like the trauma, and then ended with, and this is why I'm deconstructing, and I'm curious, like for your journey, do you think your deconstruction was more attributed to bad theology or just people, like the representatives of, the Christian faith?
Yeah, I think there's an element of both to that. And here's what I mean by that. If it's okay, I'm going to read my definition of deconstruction because I think this is going to help frame it. So in the book, I define deconstruction, and I'm not trying to be an academic about this. I'm not trying to say this is the end-all be-all definition. I'm trying to describe a really personal experience that is different for a lot of people and create a bridge for people to actually have a good conversation with each other. So that's the purpose of this definition. So the way that I define it is deconstruction is a crisis of faith that leads to the questioning of core doctrines and untangling of cultural ideologies that settles in a faith that is different than before. So there's a few different aspects of that, right? So I think when people think of deconstruction, they think of the things that you kind of just talked about. Like there's a doctrinal level, questioning those core doctrines, core theological issues. There's the untangling cultural ideologies, which I think even gets at some of the relational things that you're talking about. So, politics is obviously a part of that, but the way people hold their views, the way people hold their politics, the way different cultural things get ingrained into the church or even an individual, and even seeing the church cover up for abusers and different things like that, all that can fall under that cultural ideologies. But what I think people fail to understand oftentimes is that those things are situated under the umbrella of a crisis of faith, right? This is an existential experience before it's an intellectual experience, and those aren't at odds. The reason I'm saying that is because I think sometimes what I hear people do is they say, oh, this person hurt you or this institution hurt you. That's why you're questioning all these core doctrines. There's truth to that. Sometimes it goes the other way around. But I don't think you can separate these as cleanly as a lot of people want to, because what we don't emphasize enough, I don't think, is that our doctrine is not simply intellectual assent. Our doctrine is actually the script for the story that we're living. And so what we believe is the story that we believe, and the story we believe is the life that we will live. And so you can't disconnect those things, because if something bad happens in your church, in your, in a relationship, in culture, politics, something like that, it's getting filtered through your doctrine. And your doctrine is going to be a lens through which you see those things, right? And so, and if those things become so incompatible with each other, then both of them are going to start fracturing and breaking, which is why you have these two things often happening in tandem with each other. It's usually not just one or the other, but it's both of them. And so, so that's why I think, is it people, is it relationships, is it culture, or is it doctrine? It's almost always both, because of that dynamic between those things. And that's actually one of the reasons why I think doctrine is very important, and having good doctrine is really important, is because it acts as that script through which you see the world. And if you have bad doctrine, or if you, for me, it wasn't even, I mean, I did have some bad doctrine, so I'm not trying to say that, but for me, it was really like underdeveloped doctrine. I didn't know why a physical resurrection is important. I didn't know why God, when we talk about the Trinity, right? The most I ever got was, you could use a bad analogy like clover leaves, or, eggs or water, and all of these are actually heresies. But what most people would say is, I don't know, it's just too much for the human mind to comprehend. It's just mind boggling. If you think about it too long, your head's going to explode. And I guess yes, there are mysteries to God that we cannot comprehend. And there are mysteries of God that have been revealed to us. And the Trinity is actually one of these things. And Jesus talks about this. He talks about it in the high priestly prayer. Before creation, you loved me. And so you understand that actually the only reason that we can say God is love is because God is Trinity. That anytime you're talking about love, you're talking about three things: the lover, the beloved, and the love between them. That is the Trinity. This is Augustine's articulation of the Trinity. And if you believe that God is love, you have just eliminated every other religion, every other ideology, every other perspective on who God is that is not Trinitarian by default. Okay, now we're cooking with something here. You know what I'm saying? Now, my belief in God as Trinity is not some abstract formulation about the character of God in a classical theist framework. It actually is directly connected to the character of God and his nature of being love itself. So that is the kind of connection between doctrine and the way that we interpret the things around us that I'm talking about. And you just multiply that infinitely, right? And so the way to maybe answer your question a little bit more directly, I'm trying to hone in here.
Yeah, sure.
I think the spark of my deconstruction was caused by a lot of these external factors, by the suffering that I experienced, by the less than compassionate environments that I was in. But it was it was able to be sustained as a process because I did not have those doctrinal, intellectual foundations and underpinnings that actually can hold a faith up, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And, I would love for you to hone in a little bit more on what you think is driving deconstruction today. So, like, when I think about the people, and I totally appreciate your story, and I think that's awesome. And when I'm thinking about the people right now that I currently know are going through some form of what we basically coined the term deconstruction, we've taken it from a philosophy into a more of a widespread, popular definition of it. And so whatever that is, I know that I know a few people going through that, which is essentially, as I understand it, questioning their faith, right? They're just, I don't know if what I believed is true. I believed X, Y, and Z, and then, the A, B, and C still happened. Mm-hmm. And it didn't, that belief didn't actually shield me or benefit me from experiencing any number of these traumatic events that I've had in my life. Is that problem of evil? Is that the main driver? Is it that God is invisible, that we can't really see him? Is that a main driver? Is it that, again, we just look at the people in the church? I know you've been talking about this, but I really would love for you to kind of comment on, how do you see it today?
Yeah.
What is driving it now in people that you're noticing?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, I think I say that there's at least three main machos that light the house of faith on fire, as I see it. So the first one, and I think this is sort of what you were getting at, Josh, and so I'll spend some time here. The first one is cultural Christianity, and I have a very specific thing that I have in mind when I say cultural Christianity. By cultural Christianity, I'm really talking about Christians in churches who have opted for more, on one hand, religious entertainment, but on the level of belief, what that comes out to is moralistic therapeutic deism. And it's funny because I used to hear about moralistic therapeutic deism all the time, and I don't hear about it as much as I used to. And I actually think that might be because it's so in the bloodstream of the church that we don't even recognize it anymore.
Yeah.
And so, Christian Smith, when he coined that phrase, he talked about there was 5 sort of core beliefs of moralistic therapeutic deism. And so the 5 core beliefs are, the first one is a God who exists and created and ordered the world and watches over human life on earth. That's actually true. We all believe that. There's nothing controversial or weird about that belief in terms of what Christians believe. It's the next 4 that it gets bad. So the second one is God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other as taught in the Bible and most other world religions. It's like, okay, well, there's some truth to that. God does want us to be good and nice and fair to each other, but that is not the point. Like that's not the gospel by any means. The gospel is that you can't be good, you can't be fair, you can't be nice. We're not just trying to be Pelagians and make bad people better. We're trying to. Jesus is making dead people alive. That is the gospel. So this completely different thing, and that's not something that's taught by world religions. And so if you come into this just thinking, oh, I'm just trying to be good, nice, and fair, and that's what we're all kind of trying to do, you don't understand the gospel at a fundamental level. That's not what we're talking about. And the third thing is that the central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself. That's not it either. If that is your central goal in life, that is actually probably the best recipe to not be happy and feel good about yourself in life. Sometimes I think, and there's a lot of ways that, moralistic therapeutic deism, there's a lot of ways that actual therapy, while being a good thing, has sort of replaced what is actually good for us in some ways. Not in that therapy can't be good to heal from wounds and hard things and traumatic experiences, but that it can sort of become a crutch for us to fall on, where we feel like we're doing the work, whatever that means. And that sort of goes on into perpetuity. Whereas what Jesus actually called us to is to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow him. That does not sound like being happy and feeling good about myself all the time. It sounds like a really hard life of self-sacrifice and serving others and suffering and a lot of things that don't actually meet that criteria. So again, we're talking about false expectations here. The fourth one is God does not need to be particularly involved in one's life except when God is needed to resolve a problem. Again, you're just talking about deism here. God has nothing really to do with your everyday life. God is needed insofar as that third point, that central goal of life to be happy and feel good, as whenever that isn't being met, that's when you need God. It's not actually through every day in your life that his grace sustains you. And then the fifth one is that good people go to heaven when they die, which is just fundamentally anti-Christian, anti-gospel. Good people do not go to heaven when they die. People who are alive in Christ, united with him, go to heaven when they die. But even then, we're not talking about the resurrection, the new creation, the new heavens and new earth. And even then, your theology is stunted about what the future actually holds for Christians and what our hope is actually in. And so if the version of Christianity that you've been raised in has that as its fundamental operating system, its default theology and doctrine, then you are set up for failure. You are absolutely set up for failure because you don't have the theological, and again, I'm always going to tie the theological and the therapeutic together, resources in order to withstand difficulty and hardship in life, whether that's personal crisis, like in loss and grief and suffering, or cultural crisis in your church or in our country or in the world. You don't have the resources to withstand that. And so you couple that, which is how I define cultural Christianity, with these other two things, and I'll go over these a little bit more quickly. Compromised churches, which is fundamentally churches that have forfeited their duty as formative communities that exist to form people in that community, as a community, into the image of Christ, to be performative communities where leadership and individual members use the church to perform identities to each other in order to gain status, control, and power, etc. I would say the moment that shift happens in a community, in a church, that church has become compromised. And then all of that is on top of compounded anxieties, which is the hard knocks of life, big and small, that we all deal with. And those first two things are deep discipleship to Christ instead of cultural Christianity, and our formative churches instead of performative churches. That's the purpose of those in some ways, is to absorb those anxieties and actually be agents of transformation and renewal in us, where it takes those anxieties in life and builds character in us. That's what Paul is getting at in Romans 5, when he says that we glory in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces endurance, character, hope, and our hope does not disappoint us, but in fact, it's through that hope that the love of God is poured out in us through the Holy Spirit. And so that those anxieties are actually meant to be transformative and redemptive in our lives. But when we don't have actual Christianity, and we don't have formative devotional churches, then those anxieties crush us and everything falls apart. So that, when I look at those three things and the dynamics between those three things, that's the best way that I know how to describe why deconstruction happens. And I don't think that's bounded by generation. I think this has always been true. If you go back and you look at a lot of, if you go read Confessions by Augustine, he went through a very similar process for very similar reasons. He left the faith when he was 18 years old, and it was a year after his dad, who really didn't invest in his life, died. So he went through a personal crisis that led to an intellectual crisis of him fleeing to join the Manichees, and it took him, 12 years to realize kind of what the mistakes that he made there and take up and read, and so I don't think it's bounded by generation, but I think the cultural forces that play into it shift over time.
Most of the people I speak to who have deconstructed aren't necessarily very vocal about it or are very public, because I get the sense that they're more concerned about, the church attacking them, something wrong with you, like why aren't you believing anymore,
I know the feeling. Yeah.
and then, like, if you do reconstruct again, it's like people think that you're the same, like the journey that you went on didn't mean anything, and now you're back in the faith. So yeah, let's go ahead and get you, the VIP committee at the church or whatever, So like I love for you just to maybe talk about that experience for you. Did you kind of make a proclamation, or was it just like people kind of figured it out? They're just like, yeah, Ian's not the same anymore,
Yeah, the famed Instagram post of I'm not a Christian anymore. Yeah. I mean, well, for me personally, this was happening when I was just around a lot of my peers a lot, you know what I mean? And this was also really before social media and the internet and everything is what it is today, And so
there was a time before social media,
and I'm barely old enough to remember it, but I do. And and so, which actually the dynamics of social media are like such a huge part of this conversation too. But and so for me, I was working a lot of this stuff out in public around my peers. Like I was, again, this is part of the trouble I ran into, was asking questions in Bible class and just raising my hand and being like, I don't know about that. Like, what about this? Or what about that? What about this way of reading Genesis 1, and then being told I'm not a Christian. I'm just like, oh my gosh, like I'm just trying to figure this out, guys, And so there's definitely that. And I understand why people don't talk about it out loud, because it's scary. I mean, this is my point of framing it as a crisis, because that is what it is. Because you understand that if you change your beliefs on these issues, there are significant downstream consequences of doing that. There's losing, God says he's our father, and he relates to us like our father, and like the best version of any father that there could possibly be, like an unimaginably good father. And if you lose that, that is, I mean, imagine, I mean, I don't know. I've lost parents in my, I've lost my mom. I've lost both grandparents who raised me. Um, and so I know what that's like to do that. And, um, that is a huge, huge loss. And so you lose that at a divine level, a cosmic level. You've lost the stability for your whole life. And so you trickle that down. Like when you're saved, you're not just saved, to God, even though you're saved into God's people, a community, a family. And so you lose God, you lose his family. If you don't have God as your father, you don't have the church as your mother, you don't have the Christians as your brothers and sisters. So you've just lost your family. And then really you've lost your identity because you've spent your whole life being told that your identity is in Christ and believing that and finding it in this community, these beliefs. And so if you lose that, you lose your identity. And then if you lose your identity, then you've really lost your entire sense of what is right, what is wrong, what is good and bad, what is your moral compass. You don't have that anymore. You have to figure out what that is now, which is why a lot of people retreat into nihilism, because it just, it's scary. And so, when you lose all of that, there's not too much incentive to be very public about this. Because it's really, you don't want to set off that chain reaction of events where you start losing all of those stabilizers in your life. And so one way of thinking about this, because again, deconstruction is this series of losses. And so I think the experiential experience of deconstruction functions in the exact same way that grief and loss does, which is these famously 5 stages of grief that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross coined. So the 5 stages of grief, as a lot of people know, are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So there's 2 ways of thinking about this. A lot of people, when they think about deconstruction, is they think about the angry ex-evangelicals that they see on Twitter and Instagram and Reddit and whatever that are extremely vocal and extremely loud. And to me, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. They're in the anger stage. Like, and when you're angry, you want to burn everything down because you want revenge, for better or for worse. You want justice. You want to see these rights or these wrongs made right, and you're angry. And so I get that. I think it can be destructive, but I understand that emotion. But there's also 4 other possible ways that this crisis looks like for people, whether that is trying to short circuit the process and get out of it without really dealing with it, which is what bargaining is, or the depression stage, which is taking a lot of those same feelings that you feel in the anger stage, but instead of turning them out towards others, you turn them in on yourself. And you feel guilt and shame and even paranoia at times. And again, maybe there's some good reason for that, but you turn that in on yourself and you just feel bad. I was duped by this and I duped others, it's scary. And so one crisis can take on these many different forms. I think one more dynamic that's a part of this that is really under-discussed is the fact that there was a study that came out a couple years ago called The Great Dechurching, and it was done by Ryan Burge and Mike Graham, who's a friend of mine, and Jim Davis. It's the largest study on American dechurching in history. And they have a segment, 40 million Americans left the church in the last 25 years. I mean, it's a bigger religious movement than both Great Awakenings combined, but it's away from the church instead of to the church, which is not great. And one of their segments is the ex-evangelical. And when I had an ex-evangelical in mind, I had someone that was not too different than me. But the average ex-evangelical is a 54-year-old white woman, which is just not who most people have in mind when they're thinking about ex-evangelicals. And so what's funny is since learning that, I've actually had conversations with women who are pretty much in that demographic, and it corroborates that. I just overlooked this for so long because it wasn't on my radar. It's not who I'm normally around. No, just by default. But it's true. And so these are people who have much more to lose by losing all these beliefs than someone in their 20s and 30s or teens do, And so I am not surprised that some people in that demographic are much quieter about their process, on balance, than maybe people who are experiencing that are younger.
Man, that is, I really appreciate that answer, and it's making me think about, to try to really understand what's going on, you have to try your best to enter into someone's experience in life. like what's going on in their brain, what's happening, why are they feeling a certain way, right? Because we don't really choose our feelings. They kind of, they happen to us. We can influence them. We can try to identify bias, cognitive bias, and all the different ways that we try to basically prove what we already believe. And yet, still, we don't have this direct control over, like, well, I'm going to believe in God today. Actually, tomorrow I'm not going to believe in God because that's not very convenient. So I'm going to just turn that little switch off. Well, that doesn't happen. It's a process. It's a painful process. And that's what you're describing, right? Like, this is real life. Like, depression comes here, loss comes here. Like, just getting into the mindset, like, it just was really powerful because I know people and I've made judgments about certain people when I've heard about their journey, and yet I haven't really heard about their mindset and the things going on and the ways in which, like, hey, I'm losing all these things. I'm spiraling. I want this place to be able to ask these questions. I want to know that you're going to be there when I answer something different than what you would like me to answer. I want to be able to trust that you're still going to be there, that you're still going to love me. And that's hard. That's hard. That's hard for a community to do. It's hard for, sometimes individuals to do, depending on like things that have happened, the circumstances, if there's been hurt involved, like between someone deconstructing and the people that are walking with them, right? Or want to walk with them. Because sometimes things come out and you're like, oh, I didn't even know you were thinking that way.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm hearing all this stuff and apparently it's made a really big deal in your life. And I have no idea. I didn't really know that it made that big of a deal. So I didn't even know how to answer you because I never knew about it. But now I've heard of all these decisions that have been made. Right. But it's like getting into that mindset. It helps you. It helps you have empathy and compassion. And it makes me think about, like, what is authentic faith? I mean, what is the way forward? Like, how can churches be a place where it's like, hey, you can wrestle with it, and you might even come down to a place where you disagree fundamentally on certain issues. Can you still be a part of this? Can you still be fully involved? How do we navigate with people that are going through deconstruction without putting too much expectation on them?
Yeah. I think that's the question, and there's lots of ways of answering that. There's not just one way of answering that. On a very individual level, we, and an institutional level, this is true too. We just simply have to extend our time horizons for people and just practice the fruit of the spirit of patience with people. People do not change overnight. People do not reach conclusions overnight. I think social media, in a lot of ways, there's a dynamic where it kind of forces us into that box, and the church can be a place. There's such an opportunity here, and it's almost backwards because, again, the environments I grew up in, they just wanted to hand you the answers and say, here you go, and if you disagree, you better agree real fast and not give you really any time. Now that's the dynamic on social media. If you put out a take out there people disagree with, you're done for, you're over. And there's this real opportunity for the church to be the spot to have patience with people, to grow and develop and to figure things out and say, it is okay that you don't have all of the answers right now. Can you just come sit and like talk with us, and we'll come for however long you want to, and we'll just talk through this. I have a friend who's a pastor, Brad Edwards, and he's a pastor in Colorado, and he has a book coming out too in the church, which is really great. I'm excited for it. But he told me the story of having a guy come to his church and loving the church and loving the community and saying, but hey, here's the deal. I can't sign your statement of faith because I'm a Universalist. So I guess I should go to the Unitarian church down the street. And Brad was like, well, hold on a second. He goes, you're a Universalist because you believe in the grace of God, right? And the guy's like, yeah, that's exactly right. I believe the grace of God is power enough to save anybody no matter what. He says, okay, so what's more gracious? You going to a place full of people that already agree with you and accept you because of that belief, or you staying in our community and being around people who accept you regardless of what you believe? Which one demonstrates God's grace more? And the guy was sort of like, oh man, I hadn't thought of it that way. So Brad was like, so here's the deal. You can't become a member because you can't affirm the statement of faith, so I can't affirm you as a member. But just stay. Just stay. Be a part of the community. You don't have to be a member. Just hang out. Be a part of the church to whatever degree that you can. And let's just see what happens. Sure enough, 2-3 years later, that guy became a member of the church because he was given time to process and figure things out and work through things. And Brad didn't rush him like, you know what, you're right. You're a universalist, heretic, got to get out of here. It's like, is that a heresy? Yes, it's a heresy. He didn't let him become a member of the church, right? So there was like actual church polity things going on there that I think Brad handled really well. But he didn't shame him. He didn't kick him out of the church. He didn't, you know what I mean? He allowed him to be a part of the community. I think that's really healthy. And so, I think one thing that my church does that I really love is we bake that into our statement of faith. So our statement of faith has core doctrines and our statement of faith has distinctives. To be a member at a church, you have to affirm the core doctrines. You can disagree on the distinctives. You're just understanding that this is what the church teaches. And I'm not going to, in some teaching capacity or like, I'm not going to undermine these beliefs, because I'm going to respect the beliefs of the church that I disagree with, even while we all affirm the core doctrines together. That is an incredible way of both holding the line on the things that are most important while allowing theological diversity within your church, and not being anxious about people holding different beliefs. And so I think being able to do that theological triage, which is something that Gavin Ortlund talks about, being able to distinguish between the most important doctrines and doctrines that are important. I don't want to diminish the importance, but it's okay if we disagree on, really, really matters. And I'm talking a lot about theology here because it's important, but really the emphasis is on our life together in Christ, how we abide together in Christ. Are we fulfilling the greatest commandments of loving the Lord God with all of our heart, soul, mind, strength, and our neighbor as ourselves? Are we doing that in covenant with each other as a church? And focusing, not focusing on doctrine, but focusing on how our doctrine actually applies to our lives and forms us as people in Christ.
I just a side note. I've never really understand church membership.
I opened up a can of worms here. Oh no.
I mean, like, I didn't grow up in the church, so it's like when I came to the faith in 2008, my wife and I were looking for a church. My wife's a PK, and we were talking about church membership at one point in time, and I'm like, what? Like, why do I have to become a member? Like, it's a church, Like, I never understood just the sort of, I don't know, administrative part of like religion. That's my own cross to bear. We don't necessarily need to get into it here.
Let me say one thing on that, because I'm not going to go in depth on this because it is a can of worms. But I'll say one thing on this because I think this is surprising for the deconstruction ex-evangelical community, but I think it's worth saying. I am, in terms of polity, imagine my frustration with this. In terms of my polity, I'm Baptist. I'm Congregationalist. Imagine going through all this deconstruction and then ending up Baptist, right? But I mean, so it's like, there's a lot of reasons for that. One, I think that is what the Bible teaches. But two, for me, what church membership does is it affirms the confession of faith of the congregants. And so what that actually does is we focus so much on the individual confession of faith that we hyper individualize our faith of just like, it's just me and Jesus. It's just me and Jesus. Our faith is not me and Jesus. Our faith is us and Jesus together. When you are saved into the church. And what a local church does is affirm the confession of faith of that person. So now what you've done is you've taken the individual authority and the subjective experience of that person, and you've objectified it. And I mean that in a positive sense, not in a negative sense. You've objectified it and saying, we see that faith of yours and we affirm it. Now, some people find that scary. Here's why I actually find a lot of comfort in that. It means that when I have questions and I have doubts and I have things that freak me out, and then I go to church on Sunday and I take the Lord's Supper with everyone around me and they're saying, we still affirm your confession of faith, then that takes my subjective experience of my salvation actually out of my hands and into the hands of others, where I can say, I don't know if I believe this. I don't know if I'm a Christian. Like, I don't know. And they say, no. We see your faith. We still affirm your confession of faith, even though you feel like you're wavering and doubting in that, right? Like that. And so, the sovereignty and security that of God in our salvation is actually tangibly applied to our lives through the church. And I think membership is the function of that.
That makes sense. I'm not totally bought in yet.
That's fine.
I attend Josh's church. So this will be a discussion Josh and I will have to have.
Is Josh your pastor?
He is my pastor.
Hey, I just made it. Josh is like, come on, man, let's go.
Josh, I would not sign your damn papers. No, but my question is, when you're going through your deconstruction, and hopefully your answer will be somewhat illustrative for other listeners that are going through the same thing, is like, what did you need from your friends, family, faith leaders, that you
That's a really good question.
Yeah, either received or wish you had received?
Wish I received. Yeah. More often than not. Man, I was just met with so much. I keep going back to that word anxiety because I think that's the right word. Anxiety. Edward Friedman, he talks about, he is a family systems therapist who died, I don't know when he died, but not too long ago. And he defines anxiety as reactivity. And so that's why I keep using that word. You can just substitute it out with reactivity. And there was, whenever I bring things up, there's just so much fear. There's so much insecurity. There's so much antagonism just for raising the question, and trying to work things out and genuinely seeking answers. And then the answers a lot of times were pretty surface level, trite, and again, all of this is sort of in service to is probably not the right word, but in tandem with just the grief and suffering that I was experiencing that was, again, largely ignored in my life. It's not that no one said nothing, but going to 13 or 12 funerals, and some of these are really close people to me, and just not receiving I think the care needed for that, and then wrestling through that intellectually and finding it anxious reactivity and antagonism and anger and insecurity, and just there's just the prevailing sense when you're in a situation like that is you look around and you think, oh, I don't think anybody here actually believes this stuff. I just don't think anybody, they say they do, and they're giving me all the bullet points and the talking points, but like on a fundamental level, I don't think anybody actually believes this stuff is real. You just feel like you're seeing through it for the first time. And so I think what I wish I saw, and there's exceptions to that. I'm not trying to paint with too broad of a brushstroke. I can think of individuals where that's not true, but just overall, that's the prevailing sense. And I think I just wish that my anxiety at the time was absorbed by mature adults who believed what they said they believed and were knowledgeable and careful, and they had the intellectual capacity and the emotional capacity to handle that, and that doesn't mean they had all the answers, and I'm not trying to say that, but just the ability to function in that tension and to keep their composure and to not lash out and attack me, but to actually, not to bring a title of my book, but to walk through it with me, and say, okay, so one example is being with a youth pastor and him coming to me one day, and I was never really on his inner circle, but I was kind of like on the circle outside of his inner circle, and he knew what I was going through. And I had recently read Love Wins by Rob Bell, which just, singles me out right there, apparently. And so talking, reading through that and him coming up to me, he's like, hey man, this is after I'm going through a lot of stuff. He goes, hey man, I'd love to catch up with you and just sort of like hear what's going on in your life. Okay, great. Finally. So I go into his office, sit down, and he says, close the door. So I close the door and he says, all right, let's talk about hell. And I was like, man, you told me you wanted to catch up on my life. You told me you wanted to hear what's going on. I was ready to tell you. And you just wanted to put me right about reading Rob Bell. You know what I mean? And it's like, I literally told him, I was like, man, if this is all you want to do, I got better things to do. I'm going to go sit with my friends. And I did. And I just left because I was like, I don't want to, it's not the conversation that needs to happen right now. You're trying to pin me down and bait and switch me and attack me instead of like really like genuinely have this conversation with me and care about my life and what's going on and what I'm thinking, And so, that's one example, but just being able to absorb my anxiety as mature believers who actually care and believe this stuff.
So I think that's really interesting, and I really enjoy hearing you talk through that, and just like your own experience and what you would have needed and what you would have wanted, what might have made a difference if you had had it, because it's we can get into weeds about the theology, about arguments for and against any number of things and doubts that people might have. But just understanding that they just need someone who cares, like that emotional component, that relational component is so key to all of this. And it's like, because I'm thinking, where do we go? How do we get to the reconstruction? I mean, we've done the deconstruction, you've done, and you've kind of really eloquently described what that is like and the experience of what that is like. Talk to us about the reconstruction, in particular, this idea of suffering and this idea of the expectation of suffering. When we have to reconstruct our faith, how do we reconstruct it in a way where it's really getting a solid foundation? And as opposed to just, again, it's kind of like Will alluded to it right at the beginning of our conversation, almost like in his first question, well, like what happens when you come back from all this, and then people kind of just expect you to be 1.0, a redux, you're here, you're back, you're just the same. But no, we want Josh 2.0, right? Better, wiser, whatever, thinking differently, and that's what you're going to get. But I might not have all the beliefs you want me to have.
Yeah.
How do we help with that?
Yeah. Well, there's so much there. I think part of this is, one thing we have to keep in mind is like, we cannot control people's reconstruction, right? This is God. This is God's work. Now we are participants in that, and God uses us, right? But this is part of the problem that I see in a lot of this conversation that frustrates people who are deconstructing is they feel controlled. That's why there are several good books that are written to people who are deconstructing to kind of help guide them through that process. I think they are good books, and they are often not well received by people who are deconstructing because they feel like it's trying to control a process that feels very uncontrollable, which is why I intentionally did not write my book to people who are deconstructing. I wrote it to the church, to help them walk with them through that. And so it's not something that we control and we're going to do, right? And it's going to be different things for different people. For me, it was more theological. I don't think that's going to be the same for everybody, but I think there's going to be that component to it, at least. But what you're talking about is just like expecting people to come back. It's like it's like a, horseshoe back around to, okay, well, you went through your period of doubt, but you're right back with us now, right? It's like, no, because there is I don't even know if this is the right word for it, but it's sort of almost a loss of innocence through this process. You can't unsee what you've seen. You can't just go back to where you've been. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to go back and hold some of those beliefs that you held before. If you're going to be an Orthodox Christian, then you're going to believe that Jesus is fully man, fully God. You're going to believe in these things, right? You're going to believe that the Bible is divine and authoritative, and like these are foundational beliefs for Christians. But you're not going to hold it in the same way. You are going to hold it in a very different way. You will probably have a much better grasp on the things that are important and not important, and you're just going to stop wanting to talk about the rapture so much. It doesn't matter, like just stop talking to me about it. I don't care. I don't care about it, And so it's just if that's what you want to harp on, not going to be interested in that conversation. But so, you're going to come back in a very different way. And man, there's so much to the question that you asked. I want to make sure I cover it, but the suffering component is a huge part of this. For me, in Paul in Romans 5 is not the only place that talks about this in scriptures. James famously talks about it. It's other places too. But that idea that we can glory in our suffering and actually see it as integrated into part of the way that God is redeeming us. Because we have these, John Mark Comer has this really helpful spiritual formation paradigm where he splits it between high control and low control. And so there's some things that we actually can control. We can control the teaching that we allow into our lives. We can control the community that we're in, and we control our practices, our habits, and our disciplines. All these things are within our control and are sort of the ways that we work with God in our discipleship and spiritual formation. But what's out of our control is the hard knocks of life, just the difficulties, the sufferings, what I call compounded anxieties of our life. Those are completely out of our control. And the only thing that can heal those is time. Like, we just have to give them time and space and allow and surrender them to God. And so there's a way of looking about it, and there's both a conservative and a progressive way of doing this that does whatever it can to keep suffering at bay, to push it away. But I don't think that's the Christian way of viewing suffering. I think the Christian view of suffering is what Paul said, which is we glory in our sufferings because we know that we are participating with Christ in his sufferings when we do that. And that has a sanctifying effect on us. And he describes it, produces endurance, character, hope, and hope, love. And really that love at the end, it's both us becoming loving people, but it's also experiencing God's love poured out into us through the Holy Spirit. There is a path to experiencing God's love that comes through suffering. And I don't think our churches teach this. I don't think our churches teach this part of the Bible. Painting with broad brushstrokes here, but this is not an aspect of discipleship that is talked about and talked. And it is setting people up with bad expectations, and it's setting people up for failure. And I think it's a deconstruction waiting to happen, that we don't teach people the role of suffering in their lives. It's a completely counterintuitive way of viewing it from the world. It is anti-prosperity gospel. It is anti-progressive prosperity gospel that wants you to always have just not feel any mental distress. It's completely anti those things. But I think we really have to recover a theology of suffering, and there's people who've done that better than others. But that has to be part of how we frame the Christian life, that the Christian life is a call to come and die. It is a call. Everybody wants to do the work. Nobody wants to take up their cross and follow Jesus, deny themselves, take up their cross and follow Jesus. But that's the call. And that includes suffering. But that suffering is part of our redemption.
Ian, how can folks, connect with you, buy your book, learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, thank you. The book is on Amazon, so that's probably the easiest way, but I think it's, everywhere else books are sold as well. I have a newsletter, a Substack newsletter, so you can go to backagainwords.com and subscribe there. I try to write weekly or bi-weekly topics adjacent to this one. Mm-hmm. And then I'm on social media, so I'm on X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it. I'm on Instagram. I'm on other places like Blue Sky and Threads, but I just don't check it as much. X and Instagram are really my main places. So yeah, you just go at Ian Harber. That's where I'm at.
Awesome. And just last parting thoughts. If somebody is in the process of deconstructing and listening to this, what message would you have for them?
I go back to Egypt in the wilderness. I go back to Doubting Thomas. I go back to Augustine, one of the greatest theologians in church history. If you are deconstructing and you're doubting your faith and you have all these questions and you don't know what's going on and you can't see God in your life right now, you are in really good company. Really, really good company. Mother Teresa, oh my goodness, you're in good company. This is super normal, really, really normal. And Christians have always dealt with this. Christians have always had categories for this. And I'm really sorry that for one reason or another, evangelicalism has decided to not have categories for this. But it doesn't mean it's not real. It doesn't mean it's not normal. And God is with you, even though he feels far right now. He feels hidden to you, but he is not gone. He is with you in this. And regardless if anybody is going to walk through this with you or not, and I sure hope they do, God is walking with you through this. He's not abandoned you, and he loves you, and stick with it and pursue the truth.
Well, with that, thanks again, Ian, for coming on the show. This has been
thank you.
Really, really touching conversation. I gotta say, especially for all the folks in my and Josh's life, we know people that are going through this. So this was very enlightening. I hope that folks buy your book, learn more about it. Church leaders buy your book. And thanks so much for being here. And to our audience. Yeah. Hey, thanks again for stopping by. Make sure you like, subscribe. And as always, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. And we'll see you later. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.